Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. Today, my heart is heavy. I'm feeling deeply upset and sad. But no matter what, I am here with you, because this family, this bond we share, means everything to me. Let's move straight into today's story, without any delay. The winter sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Trevor Innovations' headquarters, painting stark lines across the polished marble floors of the executive floor. Callista Brett's reflection caught her eye as she passed the gleaming surface, a poised figure in a tailored charcoal blazer, her dark skin glowing with quiet determination, crown of intricate braids arranged perfectly. Every detail of her appearance had been calculated, an armor of professionalism she'd crafted over 2 years as executive assistant to Nevada's most enigmatic CEO. The quarterly reports in her arms felt heavier than usual this morning. Perhaps it was the weight of the information they contained, Trevor Innovations' most successful year to date, or perhaps it was the knowledge that in exactly 4 minutes, she would have to present them to Oakley Trevor himself. Her fingers traced the embossed company logo on the leather portfolio, a habit she'd developed whenever her thoughts strayed to her boss. The vast 40th floor was silent, save for the subtle click of her heels against marble. Most employees wouldn't arrive for another hour, but Callista had long ago learned that excellence demanded early mornings and late nights. The pre-dawn quiet had become her sanctuary, a time when she could almost pretend the building belonged to her alone. Almost, because Oakley Trevor always arrived before her, no matter how early she came in. She paused before the heavy mahogany doors of his office, using the moment to steady her breathing. The familiar scent of coffee drifted from within, dark roast, black, the same blend he'd had imported from a small Colombian farm for the past decade. Another detail she wasn't supposed to know, wasn't supposed to notice, yet somehow had catalogued along with countless others. The way his left hand always twitched slightly before closing a major deal, how his voice dropped half an octave when he was truly angry, the exact shade of steel grey his eyes turned when winter light hit them just so. Dangerous thoughts, unprofessional thoughts. Callista smoothed her blazer, squaring her shoulders. She was good at her job, exceptional even, because she understood boundaries. The invisible lines that separated CEOs from their employees, the professional from the personal, reality from fantasy. She'd watched others in her position fail to maintain those lines, had seen the wreckage of careers and reputations in the wake of workplace romances gone wrong. The company policy on interpersonal relationships sat in Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Employee Handbook. She'd memorized it during her first week, back when Oakley Trevor was just a name and a reputation. To maintain professional integrity and prevent conflicts of interest, romantic or sexual relationships between employees of significantly different ranks are strictly prohibited. Violations will result in immediate termination, simple, clear, necessary. She rapped her knuckles against the door, 3 precise knocks that echoed in the empty hallway. "Come in, Callista." Her name in his voice, deep, rich, with just a hint of morning roughness, sent an unauthorized shiver down her spine. She pushed it aside with practiced ease as she entered his domain. Oakley Trevor's office was a study in controlled power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of downtown Reno, the city sprawling below like a glittering chessboard in the pre-dawn light. The furniture was minimal but luxurious, leather, steel and glass arranged with mathematical precision, and at the center of it all, behind a desk of polished black granite, sat the man himself. He didn't look up immediately when she entered, his attention fixed on something on his tablet. This was part of their morning dance, these few seconds where she could observe him without fear of meeting his gaze. Today, he wore a charcoal suit that matched the winter sky, the crisp white of his shirt, a stark contrast against his tanned skin. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as though he'd been running his fingers through it, a telltale sign that he'd been working since the early hours. "The quarterly reports, Mr. Trevor," she said, her voice carrying the professional warmth she'd perfected. Not too distant, not too familiar, a balance as delicate as a tightrope walker's. He looked up then, and Callista felt the familiar impact of his full attention. Oakley Trevor didn't simply look at people. He saw them, stripped away their pretenses with those penetrating grey eyes until they felt exposed, transparent. Lesser executives had crumbled under that gaze. Callista had trained herself to meet it with calm professionalism, even as her pulse betrayed her with its quickened rhythm. "Early as always, Ms. Brett." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Though I'm beginning to think we should discuss your tendency toward working excessive hours. Says the man who's been here since 4 a.m., she countered, then immediately bit her tongue. It was too familiar, too close to banter. She covered the slip by stepping forward and placing the portfolio on his desk with precise movements. Something flickered in his eyes. Amusement? Interest? Before his professional mask slipped back into place. "You monitor my hours now." "The security logs are part of my weekly review," she replied smoothly. "For scheduling purposes only, of course." "Of course." He reached for the portfolio, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest moment. Static electricity, she told herself, as warmth bloomed from the point of contact. Nothing more. Callista took a step back, maintaining the invisible boundary line she'd drawn in her mind. Close enough to be efficient, far enough to be proper. She watched as he opened the portfolio, his strong hands handling the pages with surprising gentleness. The silence stretched between them as he reviewed the figures, broken only by the soft whisper of turning pages and the distant hum of the building's heating system fighting against the Nevada winter. Callista used the time to recite Section 7, Paragraph 3 in her head, a mantra against the treacherous thoughts that tried to slip through her professional armor. "Impressive results," he said finally, looking up from the reports. "The new renewable energy division has exceeded projections by 23%. "Yes, sir. The team has been particularly motivated since your announcement of the profit-sharing initiative." He nodded, but his attention seemed to have shifted. He was studying her now with an intensity that made her want to fidget. She resisted the urge, keeping her posture perfect. "You disagree with something in the reports?" she prompted, trying to redirect his focus. "No." He leaned back in his chair, a move that should have made him seem more relaxed, but somehow only emphasized his commanding presence. "I'm wondering if you've heard the rumors about the upcoming changes to the company's structure." Callista's heart skipped a beat. Of course she'd heard the rumors. Whispers of a possible merger, speculation about major policy revisions. Her network of contacts throughout the company made sure she heard everything. But admitting that felt dangerous suddenly, like stepping onto thin ice. "I make it a policy not to engage with office gossip, Mr. Trevor," she said carefully. His smile widened slightly, knowing. "A diplomatic answer, one of your many talents, Ms. Brett." He stood in one fluid motion, and Callista fought the urge to step back as he rounded the desk. "But I think it's time we discuss some of these changes directly. Clear your schedule for tomorrow. We're taking a trip to Lake Tahoe." The words hit her like a physical force. A trip. Alone. With him. Every professional instinct screamed in protest, even as something deeper, more primitive, hummed with anticipation. "Sir, I don't think—" "The Stellar Group merger," he interrupted smoothly. "It requires personal attention, and as my executive assistant, you'll need to be fully briefed on the details." His tone was purely professional, but there was something in his eyes. A challenge, perhaps, or a question. Callista's mind raced through potential objections, all of them sound, all of them professional. The weather forecast predicted storms. The merger documents could be handled virtually. Proper protocols suggested having legal present for such discussions. But she was good at her job. Exceptional, even. because she understood that sometimes business required personal risks, and Oakley Trevor had never given her reason to doubt his professional integrity. "I'll make the arrangements," she heard herself say, her voice steady despite the sudden drumming of her heart. "Good." He turned back to the windows, his silhouette sharp against the brightening sky. "That will be all for now, Miss Brett." She turned to leave, her steps measured, her posture perfect. Only when the heavy door closed behind her did she allow herself to lean against it, just for a moment, just long enough to steady her breathing. Through the thick wood, she could have sworn she heard him sigh, a sound so faint it might have been imagination. Dangerous thoughts, unprofessional thoughts. Callista straightened, squared her shoulders, and walked away from his office. The click of her heels against marble echoed through the empty floor, keeping time with the mantra in her head, Section 7, Paragraph 3. The unspoken rule that kept her safe, kept her professional, kept her from acknowledging the electricity that sparked every time steel-grey eyes met hers, across careful distances. The sun finally crested the mountains, flooding the floor with winter light. Another day at Trevor Innovations was beginning, and Callista Brett had work to do. Tomorrow's complications could wait. For now, there were boundaries to maintain, lines to remember, and a professional reputation to protect. But as she settled at her desk, she couldn't quite suppress the shiver of anticipation that ran through her at the thought of tomorrow's drive to Lake Tahoe. After all, even the strongest rules sometimes bent under the weight of winter storms and unspoken desires. Chapter 2. The Nevada venture dawn broke over the Sierra Nevada mountains like liquid gold, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of amber and rose. Callista stood in her apartment, watching the sunrise through floor-to-ceiling windows that had initially convinced her to rent this overpriced downtown Reno flat. The view helped her think, and this morning she needed clarity more than ever. Her overnight bag sat by the door, packed and repacked 3 times since 3 a.m., when sleep had proven impossible. Each item had been chosen with careful consideration. Professional attire in neutral colors, comfortable yet elegant, nothing that could be misinterpreted as trying too hard. The weather forecast for Lake Tahoe showed clear skies, but she'd included a warm coat anyway. Mountain weather was notoriously unpredictable in January. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Oakley's name appeared on the screen, sending an unauthorized flutter through her stomach. "Change of plans. I'll pick you up. 7 a.m. Callista's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She should insist on driving separately. It was the professional thing to do. Company policy actually recommended it. But before she could type a response, another message appeared. "The Stellar Group pushed up the timeline. We need to review the merger documents en route." And there it was, the perfect professional excuse that made any objections seem unreasonable. Oakley Trevor had always been skilled at creating situations that were technically above reproach, while dancing along the edges of propriety. It was part of what made him such a successful CEO, and what made him so dangerous to her peace of mind. She texted back a simple, "Understood," and moved to the kitchen, knowing sleep was now completely out of the question. The ritual of making coffee gave her hands something to do while her mind raced through contingency plans. She'd arranged for them to stay at separate lodges near the meeting venue. The Lake Tahoe Resort Hotel for him, a smaller boutique hotel 3 blocks away for herself. The merger discussion was scheduled for 2 p.m., giving them plenty of time for the drive and preparation. Everything was organized, professional, proper. So why did it feel like she was missing something crucial? The sound of a car pulling up outside her building sent her heart into an unexpected rhythm. 7 o'clock exactly. Oakley's military precision was legendary within the company. Callista took one last look in the mirror, adjusting her blazer and checking that every braid was perfectly in place. Her reflection showed exactly what she wanted it to: Competence, professionalism, and absolutely no hint of the anticipation curling in her stomach. She grabbed her bag and coat, locked her apartment, and rode the elevator down to the lobby. Each floor passed with a soft ding that seemed to echo her heartbeat. Ground floor, deep breath, shoulders back, game face on. The lobby doors opened to reveal Oakley's car, not the expected company Tesla, but his personal vehicle, a midnight blue Audi RS7, its sleek lines gleaming in the early morning light. He stood beside it, somehow managing to look both perfectly put together and casually approachable in a charcoal sweater and dark jeans. The sight of him in anything but a suit was so unexpected that Callista almost missed a step. "Good morning, Miss Brett," he said, taking her bag before she could protest. "I hope you don't mind the change in transportation. The company cars are all in for winter maintenance." Another perfectly reasonable explanation that felt like a carefully crafted move in some game she didn't quite understand. "Of course not, Mr. Trevor," she replied, keeping her tone professionally pleasant. He opened the passenger door for her, an old-world courtesy that seemed at odds with his usual efficiency-focused behavior. As she settled into the leather seat, she caught a whiff of his cologne, something woodsy and expensive that she definitely shouldn't have catalogued in her memory, yet had. The interior of the car was warm, the heated seats already activated against the morning chill. Oakley slid into the driver's seat with fluid grace, and suddenly the space felt intimate, in a way that all her careful planning hadn't accounted for. The center console between them seemed like an inadequate barrier. "I took the liberty of bringing coffee," he said, gesturing to 2 travel mugs in the cup holders. "Your usual vanilla latte with an extra shot." Callista stared at the cup, something warm and dangerous unfurling in her chest. She hadn't realized he knew her coffee order. "Thank you," she managed, reaching for the mug to give her hands something to do. The engine purred to life, and they pulled away from her building into the quiet Sunday morning streets. Reno was still waking up, the casino lights dimming against the strengthening daylight. Callista pulled out her tablet, determined to keep things professional. "I've prepared a summary of the key points from the Stellar Group's latest proposal," she began, but Oakley held up a hand. "Let's wait until we're out of the city," he said, his eyes on the road. "There's something else we should discuss first." Warning bells chimed in Callista's head. She'd learned that tone over the past 2 years. It was the one he used before dropping corporate bombshells. "Sir?" "Oakley," he corrected, glancing at her briefly. "We're going to be spending the next 12 hours together, Callista. I think we can dispense with the formalities." The use of her first name sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter morning. "I don't think that would be appropriate," she said carefully. "Why not?" His question was gentle, but carried that same intensity that made board members squirm. "We're both adults. The company handbook doesn't mandate formal address outside of office hours." She knew he was right. She'd memorized that handbook cover to cover. But she also knew that formality was her shield, her protection against thoughts and feelings that had no place in a professional relationship. "Nevertheless," she began, but he interrupted her again. "Do you know why I chose you as my executive assistant 2 years ago?" The question caught her off guard. "My qualifications were excellent, but not unique," he finished. "There were 16 candidates with similar experience and education." He navigated onto the highway toward Lake Tahoe, the car's powerful engine humming beneath them. "I chose you because in your interview you were the only one who challenged me." Callista remembered that day vividly, the nerve-wracking wait, the rapid-fire questions, and yes, the moment when she disagreed with his assessment of a hypothetical business scenario. She'd thought she'd blown her chances. "You said my approach to the merger situation was too conservative," he continued, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. That I was missing opportunities by focusing solely on immediate gains. You were right, by the way. That was a professional observation, she said, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Everything with you is professional, Callista. Every word, every action, calculated and precise. His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Don't you ever get tired of maintaining such rigid boundaries? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Outside, the landscape was changing, urban sprawl giving way to the rugged beauty of the Sierra Nevada foothills. Pine trees lined the highway, their branches heavy with fresh snow from last night's flurries. Boundaries exist for a reason, she finally said, her voice softer than she intended. They protect everyone involved. Protection from what? His question seemed to fill the car's intimate space. From making mistakes, from taking risks, from feeling something real. Callista's heart thundered in her chest. This conversation was veering into dangerous territory, crossing lines she'd drawn in her mind long ago. From complications that could damage both our careers, she said firmly, the merger is more complicated than you know. He switched lanes smoothly, passing a slower vehicle. Everything is about to change, Callista. The company, the policies, the boundaries you're so careful to maintain. What do you mean? The Stellar Group merger isn't just about expanding market share. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. It's about creating something new, something that wouldn't be bound by traditional corporate structures. The implications of his words made her head spin. You're restructuring the entire company? I'm rebuilding it from the ground up. There was passion in his voice now, the kind she'd only heard when he talked about his most ambitious projects. The old rules, the rigid hierarchies, they belong to a bygone era. The future is about authentic connections, genuine relationships, breaking down the artificial barriers that keep people from reaching their full potential. Callista's analytical mind raced ahead, seeing the possibilities and pitfalls. The board would never approve such a dramatic change. They already have. He glanced at her, his grey eyes intense. That's what tomorrow's meeting is really about. The Stellar Group isn't just merging with us. They're helping us pioneer a new way of doing business. The revelation settled over her like a heavy blanket. Everything she thought she knew about this trip, about her role, about the careful boundaries she'd maintained, was shifting beneath her feet. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Oakley was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on the road ahead. The mountains loomed closer, their snowy peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds that hadn't been in the forecast. "Because you deserve to know that the rules you've been following so diligently are about to change," he finally said, "and because I want you to understand why I chose this particular moment to tell you, which is, we're about to spend the next several hours together, possibly longer if those clouds mean what I think they do." He nodded toward the gathering storm ahead. "And I want us to be honest with each other, Callista. No titles, no artificial boundaries, just two people having a real conversation." The implications of his words, combined with the darkening sky ahead, sent a shiver of anticipation down her spine. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd tried to avoid, exactly the reason she'd wanted to drive separately. But as the first snowflakes began to hit the windshield, Callista realized that sometimes the universe had other plans. The carefully constructed walls of her professional world were about to face their greatest test, and she wasn't entirely sure she wanted them to hold. The highway curved upward into the mountains, taking them higher into the gathering storm. Ahead lay Lake Tahoe, the merger meeting, and what felt increasingly like a turning point in both their lives. Callista took a sip of her perfectly prepared latte, the one he shouldn't have known to order, and wondered if some boundaries were meant to be crossed. Chapter 3. Nature's Intervention. The storm descended upon them with the fury of a scorned goddess. What had started as gentle snowflakes transformed into sheets of freezing rain, drumming against the Audi's roof with increasing intensity. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge, and visibility dropped to mere feet ahead of their vehicle. Oakley's hands gripped the steering wheel with careful precision, his knuckles white with tension. The luxury car's all-wheel drive system worked overtime as they navigated the increasingly treacherous mountain roads. Despite the heating system's best efforts, a chill had crept into the cabin, carrying with it an electric tension that had nothing to do with the weather. "The latest weather report shows no sign of improvement," Callista said, her eyes fixed on her tablet screen, purposefully avoiding the way Oakley's profile was illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning. "There's a severe weather warning for the entire Lake Tahoe region." "What about the Stellar Group representatives?" Oakley's voice remained steady, but Callista caught the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth, a tell she'd learned to recognize over their years working together. She tapped through her emails. "They're delayed in San Francisco. Their pilot won't attempt the flight in these conditions." A particularly loud crack of thunder punctuated her words, making her jump slightly in her seat. The movement caused her hand to brush against Oakley's arm, and the brief contact sent sparks through her that rivaled the lightning outside. "We should find somewhere to wait out the storm," Oakley said, his voice lower than usual. "There's no point in risking these roads if the meeting will be delayed." Callista nodded, already pulling up maps on her tablet. The screen's blue light cast shadows across her face as she searched for nearby options. "There's a small town about 3 miles ahead, Pine Valley. It has a few lodging options." Another flash of lightning illuminated the world in stark white, followed almost immediately by a deafening thunderclap. The storm was directly overhead now, and the freezing rain had become biblical in proportion. Ice began to form on the edges of the windshield, creating ghostly patterns that distorted the world beyond. "The temperature's dropping fast," Oakley observed, his attention divided between the treacherous road and the car's external thermometer. "We need to get off this mountain before the roads become completely impassable." As if in response to his words, the car's tires lost traction for a heart-stopping moment. Oakley handled it expertly, but Callista's hand flew to the door handle, her knuckles white with tension. Without thinking, Oakley reached over and covered her hand with his own. "Trust me," he said softly. "I won't let anything happen to you." The warmth of his hand, the gentleness in his voice, it was too much, too intimate, yet Callista couldn't bring herself to pull away. The storm raged around them, but in that moment, the only thing she could focus on was the way his thumb brushed ever so slightly across her knuckles. A sign emerged from the curtain of rain. Pine Valley. Next exit. Oakley carefully navigated the turning, the steep road now slick with a dangerous mixture of rain and ice. The small town materialized through the storm like a mirage. A collection of rustic buildings huddled against the mountainside, their windows glowing warmly against the preternatural darkness of the storm-racked afternoon. "The Pinecrest Inn," Callista read from her tablet, her voice slightly unsteady. "It's the highest-rated accommodation in town. Family-owned, historic property." She didn't mention that it was also the only lodging currently showing vacancy. Something about saying those words aloud felt dangerous. The inn appeared before them, a grand old building of stone and timber that looked like it had grown straight out of the mountainside. Victorian architecture met alpine charm, with wide wraparound porches and gabled windows. In better weather, it would have been picturesque. In the storm, it looked like salvation. Oakley parked as close to the entrance as possible, but they were still drenched by the time they made it inside. The inn's lobby was a haven of warmth and light, all polished wood and crackling fireplaces. An elderly woman looked up from behind the front desk, her silver hair arranged in an elegant bun, her eyes twinkling with something that looked suspiciously like amusement. "Welcome to Pinecrest Inn," she said, her voice warm and knowing. "I'm Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the owner. You picked quite a day for a drive up the mountain." Callista tried to suppress a shiver, her wet clothes doing little to ward off the chill. Without a word, Oakley shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was smooth, natural, as if he'd done it 100 times before. His scent enveloped her, woodsy and masculine, making her head spin slightly. "We need 2 rooms," she said quickly, stepping forward, "just for the night, until the storm passes." Mrs. Whitman's fingers danced over her ancient computer keyboard, her expression growing increasingly apologetic. "I'm afraid we have only 1 room available," she said, looking between them with that same knowing twinkle. "The storm has brought quite a few travelers seeking shelter." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Callista's mind raced through alternatives. They could try another inn, drive back down the mountain, find separate accommodations somehow. But the howling wind and another crash of thunder outside made all those options seem foolish at best, dangerous at worst. "We'll take it," Oakley said firmly, already reaching for his wallet. His tone brooked no argument, but Callista noticed the slight roughness in his voice, the way his breathing had changed almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Whitman smiled as she processed the payment. "Room 307, she said, handing over an actual key, not a key card, but an ornate brass key that looked as historic as the building itself. "Top floor, best view in the house. When the storm clears, you'll be able to see all the way to Lake Tahoe." She paused, her eyes twinkling, though with weather like this, that might not be until morning. Callista's cheeks burned as she followed Oakley up the grand staircase, their wet shoes leaving traces on the plush carpet. The inn's antiquated heating system fought valiantly against the storm's chill, but drafts still whispered through the corridors, carrying with them the scent of pine and wood smoke. Room 307 was at the end of a long hallway, under one of the distinctive gables they'd seen from outside. Oakley's hands were steady as he turned the key in the lock, but Callista noticed the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he was holding himself apart from her. The room was beautiful, spacious and well-appointed, with a king-sized bed dominated by a handmade quilt in shades of blue and silver. A stone fireplace occupied one wall, already laid with logs and kindling. Large windows looked out over the storm-racked landscape, and a comfortable sitting area with 2 armchairs was arranged near them. 1 bed, 1 room. No boundaries left except the ones they chose to maintain. "I'll take one of the chairs," Oakley said immediately, setting their bags down. "You should change out of those wet clothes before you catch cold." Callista clutched his coat tighter around her shoulders, suddenly very aware of how her wet clothing clung to her body. She started, but another violent shiver interrupted her words. Oakley stepped closer, concern evident in his steel-grey eyes. "You're freezing," he observed, his hand coming up to brush a water droplet from her cheek. The touch was feather-light, but it burned like fire against her cold skin. "This isn't appropriate," she whispered, even as she felt herself leaning slightly into his warmth. "Nothing about this situation is appropriate," he agreed, his voice rough. "But I'm not going to let you make yourself sick for the sake of propriety." Before she could respond, another thunderclap shook the building, and the lights flickered ominously. They both held their breath, waiting, but the power held. Outside, the storm continued to rage, nature's fury providing a dramatic backdrop to the tension building in the room. Callista took a step back, needing distance to think clearly. "We should contact the Stellar Group," she said, reaching for her professional persona like a lifeline. "Reschedule the meeting, make arrangements." Callista, just her name, but the way he said it, soft, intimate, with a wealth of meaning, made her stop mid-sentence. The meeting, the merger, the company, it can all wait until morning. Right now, you need to get warm and dry. Please. It was the please that undid her, so unlike his usual commanding presence, so genuine in its concern. She nodded slightly, grabbed her overnight bag, and retreated to the bathroom. The door closed between them with a soft click that seemed to echo in the charged atmosphere. Callista leaned against the bathroom counter, staring at her reflection in the antique mirror. Her carefully arranged braids were damp but intact, her makeup somehow still perfect, but her eyes told a different story. They were wide, uncertain, filled with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. The storm continued its assault outside, and somewhere in the back of her mind, Callista wondered if this was nature's way of forcing them to face what they'd been dancing around for 2 years. In this remote mountain inn, trapped by ice and thunder, all the carefully constructed walls between them were beginning to crack like ice in spring thaw. She changed quickly into dry clothing, thankful that she'd packed for every contingency, and tried not to think about the night ahead. 1 room, 1 bed, and a storm that showed no signs of abating. The universe, it seemed, had plans of its own, regardless of company policies and professional boundaries, and as another flash of lightning illuminated the world outside, Callista couldn't quite silence the part of her that wondered if maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all. Chapter 4. The Last Room. The ancient radiator in room 307 fought valiantly against the winter chill, but the storm's icy fingers still found ways to seep through the Victorian windows. Callista emerged from the bathroom in thick leggings and an oversized sweater, her professional armor exchanged for comfort out of necessity. She'd let her braids down, and they cascaded over her shoulders in intricate waves, still slightly damp from the rain. Oakley had been busy during her absence. The fireplace now crackled with life, casting dancing shadows across the room's rich wooden surfaces. He'd shed his wet outer layers, leaving him in a charcoal cashmere sweater that did nothing to diminish his commanding presence. If anything, the casual attire made him more dangerous to her peace of mind. "Mrs. Whitman sent up tea," he said, gesturing to a silver service that had appeared on the antique writing desk. "And some interesting news about our situation." Callista wrapped her arms around herself, trying to suppress a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The storm. Getting worse. He moved to pour tea into delicate china cups that looked like they belonged in a museum. "The road we came up on is already closed. Highway Patrol is advising everyone to stay put until morning at least." The implications of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. They were truly trapped here, in this room, together. No escape routes, no professional distance to maintain. Just them and the storm and all the unspoken things that had been building for 2 years. "I see," she managed, accepting the cup he offered. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, sending little sparks of electricity up her arm. The tea was perfectly prepared. Honey, but no milk, exactly how she liked it. Another detail he shouldn't have known, but somehow did. "You should take the bed," Oakley said, moving to stand by the window. The storm provided a dramatic backdrop to his silhouette, lightning occasionally illuminating his strong profile. "I'll be comfortable enough in one of the chairs." "Don't be ridiculous," Callista found herself saying, the words escaping before she could censor them. "You're too tall for these chairs. You'll be miserable all night." He turned to look at her, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. "Are you suggesting we share?" "No, I mean—" She took a sip of tea to cover her flustered response. "I'll take the chair. I'm smaller." "Not happening." His tone carried that same authority that made board members snap to attention, but there was something else there too, a gentleness that made it more dangerous somehow. "You're still cold from the rain. You need proper rest." As if to emphasize his point, Another violent shiver ran through her body. The room's chill seemed to be deepening despite the fire's best efforts. Outside, the storm's fury increased, wind howling around the inn's eaves like a living thing. "We're both adults," Oakley continued, his voice dropping slightly. "The bed is large enough. We can maintain appropriate distance." Callista almost laughed at that. Appropriate distance had been their dance for 2 years, and now here they were, trapped in a mountain inn with one bed and a storm that seemed determined to push them together. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. "What about Section 7, Paragraph 3? She asked, clinging to the rulebook like a lifeline. "You mean the policy I'm about to completely restructure?" He set his tea down and took a step toward her. "The one that's going to be obsolete in less than 24 hours? "It's not obsolete yet," she whispered, but her protest sounded weak, even to her own ears. The lights flickered ominously, and the radiator made a concerning sound before falling silent. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably within seconds. "Perfect timing," Oakley muttered, moving to check the ancient heating unit. After a moment of inspection, he straightened with a grim expression. "The power's still on, but the heating system's given up." Another shiver racked Callista's frame, this one violent enough to make her teeth chatter. Without hesitation, Oakley crossed the room and retrieved a thick blanket from the bed, wrapping it around her shoulders. His hands lingered for a moment, warm and strong against her upper arms. "Your lips are turning blue," he observed, his voice rough with concern. "I'm fine," she managed, but her body betrayed her with another shiver. "No, you're not." His hands moved to cup her face, and the warmth of his touch was like fire against her cold skin. "You're freezing. Your body temperature dropped too much from being in those wet clothes." She should step back, should maintain professional distance, should recite company policies until this moment passed. But his hands were so warm, and she was so cold, and the storm kept pushing them closer together with each passing moment. "The human body loses heat fastest through the head and extremities," he continued, his thumbs brushing gentle circles on her cheeks. "Basic survival skills. We need to get you warm." "And how do you suggest we do that?" The words came out breathy, uncertain. "Body heat," he said simply, "the most efficient way to warm someone up. Scout's honor." "You were never a scout," she said, a weak attempt at humor. "No, but I did take extensive survival training before that solo hiking trip in Alaska last year." His eyes held hers, serious now. "This isn't a line, Callista. You're showing early signs of hypothermia, and we're trapped in a Victorian inn with failing heat during the worst storm this region has seen in years." As if to emphasize his point, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, and the temperature seemed to drop another few degrees. The fire in the hearth flickered dramatically, shadows dancing across the room's surfaces. "Trust me," he whispered, echoing his words from the car. "Just trust me." And maybe it was the cold, or the storm, or the way he was looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered in the world, but Callista found herself nodding slightly. Oakley moved with careful efficiency, guiding her to the bed without releasing her completely, as if afraid she might collapse. He arranged the quilts and blankets into a nest of sorts, then helped her lie down, still wrapped in the blanket he'd given her. "Close your eyes," he said softly, and she felt the bed dip as he settled beside her. Strong arms wrapped around her, pulling her against a chest that radiated warmth like a furnace. One of his hands came up to cradle the back of her head, tucking it under his chin. "This is highly inappropriate," she mumbled against his sweater, even as her body betrayed her by melting into his warmth. "Saving you from hypothermia? I think the HR department would make an exception." His chest rumbled with quiet laughter, and the sound did something to her insides that had nothing to do with temperature regulation. They lay in silence for a while, the storm providing a dramatic soundtrack to their unprecedented proximity. Gradually, feeling returned to Callista's extremities, along with an acute awareness of every point of contact between their bodies. Oakley's hand had begun moving in slow, soothing circles on her back, and each stroke sent little sparks of electricity through her nervous system. "Better?" he asked after what could have been minutes or hours. His voice was lower than usual, intimate in a way that made her shiver for entirely different reasons than the cold. "Yes," she whispered, knowing she should pull away now that the danger had passed, but his arms tightened slightly, as if reading her thoughts. "Not yet," he said. "Your body temperature needs to stabilize completely. Doctor's orders." "You're not a doctor either." "No, but I did date one in college. She was very informative about hypothermia." Callista stiffened slightly at the mention of his past relationships, and she felt him smile against her hair. "Jealous, Miss Brett?" "That would be inappropriate," she said primly, trying to ignore the way her heart skipped at his teasing tone. His hand continued its maddening circles on her back. "You know what I think? I'm sure you'll tell me. I think you hide behind that word, inappropriate, like a shield against feeling anything real." His voice was gentle but carried an edge of challenge. "I think you're afraid." "Of what?" She tried to pull back to look at him, but his arms held her close. "Of admitting that there's something here, something that transcends job titles and company policies, something that's been building since the day you walked into my office and told me I was wrong about that merger strategy." Callista's heart thundered in her chest, so loud she was sure he must be able to hear it. "We can't," she whispered, but even to her own ears it sounded weak. "Can't? Or won't?" His hand moved to cup her cheek again, and this time he did let her pull back enough to meet his gaze. In the firelight, his eyes were dark with something that made her breath catch. "The world is changing, Callista. The old rules are falling away. Maybe it's time to stop hiding behind them." The storm chose that moment to unleash its loudest thunderclap yet, and the lights went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the warm glow of the fireplace. The sudden intimacy of the setting was overwhelming. "I should check on the power," Oakley said, but he made no move to release her. "You should," Callista agreed, her fingers curling into his sweater of their own accord. Neither of them moved. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across their entwined forms. Outside, the storm raged on. But in that moment, in that bed, time seemed to stand still. "Tell me to let go," Oakley whispered, his breath warm against her face. "Tell me this isn't what you want, and I'll spend the night in that uncomfortable chair, and tomorrow we can pretend none of this ever happened." Callista knew she should say it, knew she should maintain the professional boundaries that had defined their relationship for 2 years. Knew she should think about careers and reputations and all the reasons this was a terrible idea. But in that moment, with his warmth surrounding her and his heart beating steady and strong against her palm, she couldn't remember any of those reasons. So instead of speaking, she lifted her face to his and did the most inappropriate thing possible. She kissed him. The storm raged on outside, but neither of them noticed. They were too busy creating their own kind of electricity, rules and boundaries forgotten in the darkness of room 307. Chapter 5. Walls of ice time seemed to stand still in room 307. The kiss lingered between them, soft and uncertain at first, then deepening with 2 years of repressed longing. Oakley's hand tangled in Callista's waves of braids, while hers remained pressed against his chest, feeling the thundering of his heart that matched her own. The firelight cast golden shadows across their faces as they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily. Reality crashed back like a wave of ice water. Callista jerked away, nearly falling off the bed in her haste. "I shouldn't have done that," she whispered, pressing her fingers to her lips as if she could erase the memory of his kiss. "That was completely..." If you say inappropriate one more time, Oakley growled, sitting up but not reaching for her, I might lose my mind. The distance between them on the bed felt like miles and millimeters all at once. The fire crackled in the hearth, its light making shadows dance across Oakley's features, turning his grey eyes almost silver. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but it felt distant compared to the tempest brewing in room 307. Then what would you call it? Callista demanded, wrapping her arms around herself. Despite the lingering warmth from their embrace, she felt cold again. But this was a different kind of chill, one born of fear and uncertainty. I'm your executive assistant. You're the CEO. There are rules, protocols. Rules that will be obsolete tomorrow, he reminded her, his voice gentler now. Protocols that are changing. You heard what I said in the car. And that makes this okay. She stood, needing physical distance to think clearly. The room's darkness worked in her favor, hiding the trembling of her hands. The fact that you're planning to change the rules doesn't negate the fact that they exist now. Oakley watched her from the bed, his posture tense but controlled. Do you regret it? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Callista moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Snow had begun to mix with the freezing rain, creating ghostly patterns in the darkness. That's not the point. It's exactly the point. She heard him stand, but didn't turn around. If you regret it, if you truly wish it hadn't happened, I'll respect that. We can go back to being Mr. Trevor and Ms. Brett, maintaining appropriate professional distance until the day you decide to move on to another company. His words sent an unexpected pain through her chest. The thought of leaving Trevor Innovations, of not seeing him every day, felt like contemplating amputation. Is that what you want? What I want? His laugh was low, almost bitter. What I want, Callista, is to stop pretending, to stop watching you walk into my office every morning and acting like I don't count the hours until I see you again. To stop maintaining artificial distance because some outdated corporate policy says we can't acknowledge what's been building between us for 2 years. She turned then, unable to resist the raw emotion in his voice. The firelight caught the angles of his face, and for the first time, she let herself really look at him. Not as her boss, not as CEO Oakley Trevor, but as the man who'd haunted her dreams for longer than she cared to admit. When did it start for you? She asked softly, surprising herself with the question. His eyes met hers across the darkened room. The merger strategy meeting. 6 months after you started. You stood your ground against the entire board, defended your analysis with such passion and intelligence. I watched you dismantle their arguments point by point, and all I could think was, I'm in trouble. The memory flooded back. The tension in the boardroom, the way the senior executives had tried to dismiss her findings, and how Oakley had sat back and let her fight her own battle. She'd thought he was testing her. Now she wondered if he'd been admiring her instead. That's when you started bringing me coffee, she remembered suddenly. After that meeting. Every morning it would be waiting on my desk. I needed an excuse to see you first thing, before you put on your professional armor. He took a step toward her, then stopped, maintaining the fragile distance between them. Your turn. When did it start for you? Callista closed her eyes, knowing honesty was the only way forward now. The charity gala, last spring. You were giving your speech about the company's new environmental initiatives, and I looked up from my notes and just saw you. Not the CEO, not my boss, just you. It terrified me. Why? Because I'd spent my entire career building walls, professional boundaries, never getting too close, never letting emotions cloud my judgment. She opened her eyes to find him closer now, though she hadn't heard him move. You made me want to break all my rules. Maybe some rules are meant to be broken. His voice was low, intimate in the darkness. Maybe some walls need to come down. It's not that simple, isn't it? Another step closer. Tomorrow the merger goes through, the company restructures, the old hierarchies dissolve. What's holding you back then? Fear, she whispered, the admission feeling like both a surrender and a victory. Fear that this could ruin everything we've both worked for. Fear that mixing professional and personal never ends well. Fear that this is real. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. That what we feel for each other isn't just attraction or forbidden fruit syndrome, but something deeper. Callista's heart hammered in her chest. She'd spent 2 years maintaining professional distance, building walls of ice between them. But here, in the darkness of room 307, with the storm raging outside and his warmth so close, those walls were melting faster than she could reinforce them. "If this goes wrong," she started, but he interrupted her. "What if it goes right?" His hand came up to cup her cheek, and she couldn't help leaning into his touch. What if all these months of holding back, of maintaining distance, were just preparing us for something extraordinary? The fire popped loudly, sending sparks up the chimney. In that brief flash of extra light, Callista saw something in Oakley's eyes that stole her breath. Vulnerability. The powerful CEO, the man who commanded boardrooms and reshaped industries, was letting her see his fear too. "I can't go back," she whispered, turning her face to press a kiss to his palm. "If we do this, if we cross this line, I can't go back to pretending. I don't want to go back." His other hand found her waist, pulling her closer. "I want to go forward, with you. No more pretending, no more walls." The storm chose that moment to unleash another thunderous volley, but neither of them flinched. They were too caught up in their own private tempest, the electricity between them rivaling any lightning. "Kiss me again," Callista breathed, and this time when their lips met, there was no uncertainty. This kiss was a promise, a declaration, a breaking down of walls that had stood for too long. Oakley's arms wrapped around her fully, lifting her slightly off her feet as he deepened the kiss. Callista's hands found their way into his hair, something she'd imagined countless times during long board meetings, but never dared to act on. He made a sound low in his throat that sent shivers down her spine, shivers that had nothing to do with the cold. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Oakley rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with me tonight," he murmured. "Not because of the storm, or the cold, or the single room. Stay because you want to." Callista knew this was the moment, the final wall, the last boundary between their old relationship and whatever this new thing was becoming. Part of her wanted to retreat, to rebuild her professional armor and pretend none of this had happened, but a stronger part, a part that had been silenced for too long, wanted to take this leap. "Yes," she whispered, and felt him smile against her lips. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside room 307, ice walls had melted completely, replaced by a warmth that no winter chill could touch. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the merger, the company restructure, the reactions of others. But for now, in the firelit darkness of their sanctuary, none of that mattered. They had finally stopped pretending, and the world hadn't ended. If anything, it felt like it was just beginning. Chapter 6. Melting Point's hours passed like whispers in room 307, marked only by the crackling of the fire and the persistent symphony of the storm outside. The power remained out, but neither Callista nor Oakley noticed the darkness anymore. They had created their own light, their own warmth, as they lay tangled together on the antique bed, trading stories and secrets in the intimate shadows. "Tell me something you've never told anyone at the office," Oakley murmured, his fingers tracing patterns on Callista's arm. They had settled into a comfortable position, her head resting on his chest, his heartbeat a steady rhythm under her ear. She smiled in the darkness. Remember that disaster meeting with the Singapore investors last year, when the presentation files mysteriously corrupted? The one where you somehow produced backup copies and saved the entire deal. His chest rumbled with quiet laughter. Don't tell me you planned that. Not exactly. Callista propped herself up on an elbow to look at him, loving how the firelight played across his features. But I may have noticed their representative checking his phone during your previous presentations. He had a habit of only paying attention when things went wrong. So you engineered a crisis to keep him engaged. Oakley's eyes widened with admiration. Devious, Ms. Brett. Absolutely devious. The deal went through, didn't it? She tried to sound professional, but couldn't help grinning. Sometimes a little strategic chaos is necessary. You've been managing me like that for 2 years, haven't you? His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing across her lower lip. All those perfectly timed interruptions during tedious meetings, the urgent calls that got me out of boring lunches. I prefer the term strategic optimization of executive time, she said primly, then squealed as he suddenly rolled them over, pinning her beneath him with gentle pressure. Strategic optimization? He growled playfully. Is that what we're calling it? Callista's laugh turned into a soft gasp as he lowered his head to press kisses along her neck. Oakley. Hmm? His mouth found a particularly sensitive spot below her ear. Yes, Ms. Brett, do you have something to add to the quarterly report? You're impossible, she managed, even as her hands slid into his hair, encouraging his attention. He lifted his head to meet her eyes, and the playfulness faded into something deeper, more intense. You're incredible, he said softly. Do you know how many times I've wanted to tell you that? How many moments I've had to bite my tongue to keep from saying exactly what I think of you? Tell me now, she whispered, heart racing at the vulnerability in his expression. You're brilliant, he punctuated the word with a kiss to her forehead. Capable. Another kiss, this time to her temple. Strong, her cheek. Beautiful, the corner of her mouth. And you terrify me completely. Callista's breath caught. I terrify you? You're Oakley Trevor. You run one of the largest companies in Nevada. You make billion-dollar decisions before breakfast. And you've had the power to wreck me since the day you walked into my office. His admission was rough, honest in a way that made her heart ache. Why do you think I never acted on this? It wasn't just the company policies or professional boundaries. It was knowing that if this went wrong, if I lost you completely. She reached up to trace the worry lines between his brows. Is that still a fear? Yes, he said simply. But staying away from you, pretending this isn't real, that terrifies me more. Thunder crashed outside, closer than before, making the windows rattle in their frames. The storm was intensifying again, but in their cocoon of firelight and shared warmth, it felt distant, unimportant. I used to have nightmares, Callista confessed, her fingers still tracing his features, memorizing them by touch. About the board finding out how I felt about you. About being labeled the cliché, the assistant in love with her boss. About losing everything I'd worked for. And now? Now I'm wondering if some things are worth the risk. She pulled him down for a soft kiss, one that quickly deepened into something more heated. Oakley groaned against her mouth, his control visibly slipping. Callista, he warned, pulling back slightly. If we don't stop now... I don't want to stop. She met his gaze steadily, letting him see the certainty in her eyes. I don't want to hold back anymore. I want... What? His voice was rough, desperate. Tell me what you want. You, she breathed. Just you. No titles, no boundaries, no pretense, just us. Something fierce and protective flashed in his eyes. Are you sure? Once we cross this line... We crossed it the moment I kissed you, she reminded him. Everything else is just details." He studied her face in the firelight, as if memorizing every detail. "I love you," he said suddenly, the words falling between them like precious stones. "I know it's too soon to say it, know it breaks all the rules of timing and propriety, but I need you to know. I love you, Callista Brett. I think I have since that first board meeting when you told me I was wrong about the merger strategy." Tears pricked at Callista's eyes, but she blinked them away, smiling up at him. "It's not too soon," she whispered. "We've been writing this story for 2 years. We just couldn't read it out loud until now." His kiss was fierce this time, passionate in a way that made her toes curl and her pulse race. All the carefully maintained distance, all the professional boundaries they'd hidden behind, melted away like snow in summer. They came together with the intensity of the storm outside, years of repressed longing finally finding expression. Later, much later, they lay tangled in the sheets, Callista's head tucked under Oakley's chin, his arms wrapped protectively around her. The fire had burned low, casting a soft amber glow across their sanctuary. Outside, the storm showed signs of weakening, the thunder more distant, the wind less fierce. "What happens tomorrow?" Callista asked softly, tracing patterns on his chest. "The merger goes through, the company transforms, and we stop pretending." His arms tightened around her. "No more hiding, no more walls. The board will adapt or be replaced." His tone carried that note of authority she knew so well. "The world is changing, Callista. Companies that cling to outdated policies, that value appearance over substance, won't survive. I'm not just restructuring the company, I'm rebuilding it for a future where talent and dedication matter more than arbitrary rules." "And us?" He shifted to look down at her, his expression serious in the dim light. "We take it one day at a time. Together. No rushing, no hiding. We do this right. Together," she repeated, liking how the word felt on her tongue. "I love you too, you know. I should have said it earlier, but—" His kiss silenced her, soft and sweet. "I knew. Every time you anticipated my needs, every time you stayed late to help with a project, every time you challenged me to be better, you were saying it in your own way." The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the mountains, turning the storm clouds from black to deep purple. A new day was coming, bringing with it challenges and changes and the weight of their decisions. But there, in room 307, wrapped in each other's arms, Callista and Oakley had found their own kind of peace. The walls of ice had melted completely, leaving behind something stronger, something real. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, no longer bound by rules and boundaries, but united by a love that had been worth the wait. Chapter 7. Thunder's Truth. Dawn crept over the Sierra Nevada mountains like a watercolor painting coming to life. The storm had weakened, but not entirely passed, occasional rumbles of thunder mixing with the first birdsong of morning. Room 307 was bathed in a peculiar light, part dying fire, part breaking day, that made everything feel slightly surreal. Callista woke slowly, her body warm and pleasantly heavy. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room and the solid warmth beside her causing a brief panic. Then the memories of the night flooded back, the storm, the confessions, the breaking down of walls that had stood for 2 years. She turned her head to find Oakley already awake, watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "How long have you been staring at me?" she murmured, fighting the urge to be self-conscious about her sleep-mussed braids and makeup-free face. "Not long enough," he replied, reaching out to trace her cheekbone with gentle fingers. "I was afraid, if I closed my eyes, I'd wake up to find this was all a dream." She caught his hand and pressed a kiss to his palm. "Not a dream. though Mrs. Whitman might disagree. This feels like something out of one of those romance novels she probably keeps at the front desk. Oakley chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest where she was pressed against him. Stranded by a storm in a mountain inn? It does sound a bit cliché, though I doubt those novels include hostile takeovers and corporate restructuring. The mention of business brought reality crashing back. Callista sat up, clutching the quilt to her chest. What time is it? The merger meeting has been postponed. Oakley propped himself up on one elbow, looking unfairly handsome with his dark hair tousled from sleep. Power's still out in half the county. The Stellar Group representatives won't be able to fly in until the weather clears. How do you know that? The power's still out here too. He reached for his phone on the bedside table. Satellite connection. I had a few messages come through about an hour ago. The meeting's been rescheduled for tomorrow. Callista processed this information, her analytical mind already spinning through implications and contingencies. That gives us time to properly prepare the revised proposals and... Stop! Oakley sat up fully, cupping her face in his hands. No work talk, not yet. We have this moment, this morning, before the real world crashes back in. Let's not waste it on quarterly projections and merger strategies. As if agreeing with him, another low rumble of thunder rolled across the mountains. The storm was moving away, but its presence lingered, reminding them of the forces that had brought them together. What should we talk about then? Callista asked, leaning into his touch. How about the fact that I've never seen you with your hair down before last night? His fingers threaded through her waves of braids. Or that you snore very slightly when you're deeply asleep? Or that you've completely ruined me for any other woman for the rest of my life? She ducked her head, overwhelmed by the intensity in his voice. Oakley ... I mean it. He tilted her chin up, making her meet his gaze. I know we have to figure out the logistics, the company, the board, the public perception, but I need you to understand something. What happened last night wasn't just about attraction or forbidden romance or the heat of the moment. This is real for me. You are real for me. I know. And she did know, could feel the truth of it in her bones. It's real for me too. That's what scares me. Why? Because I've spent my whole career being the consummate professional, the one who never lets emotion cloud her judgment, the one who maintains appropriate boundaries. She took a shaky breath, and now here I am, in bed with my boss, having broken every rule in the corporate handbook. Former boss, he corrected gently. Remember, the restructuring isn't just about merging companies, it's about creating something entirely new. And in this new structure, you won't be reporting to me. Callista blinked. What? Oakley shifted, pulling her closer. That's what I've been trying to tell you. The merger with Stellar Group isn't a traditional corporate acquisition. We're creating a new kind of company, one with a flat organizational structure, where talent and innovation matter more than titles and hierarchy. And my role in this new structure, Chief Strategy Officer. He smiled at her shocked expression. Who better to help shape the future of the company than the woman who's been quietly running it for the past 2 years? But the board already approved it. Your promotion was going to be announced at today's meeting. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. Your track record speaks for itself, Callista. The Singapore deal, the renewable energy division, the new profit-sharing initiative, those were all your ideas. I just had the good sense to implement them. Tears pricked at her eyes. You're serious? Completely. His thumbs brushed away the moisture gathering at her lashes. You've earned this, completely independent of what's happening between us. Though I have to admit, being able to love you openly is a rather wonderful bonus. She laughed through her tears, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was telling her. "This is really happening, all of it." "All of it," he confirmed. "The company is changing. We're changing. Everything we've been holding back, everything we've been afraid to acknowledge, it doesn't have to be hidden anymore." A particularly bright ray of sunlight broke through the storm clouds, painting the room in shades of gold. Outside, the world was waking up, the ice from the storm beginning to melt in the morning light. It felt symbolic somehow. The dawn of a new day, a new chapter, a new way of being. "What happens now?" Callista asked, though she wasn't sure if she meant in the next 5 minutes or the next 5 years. "Now?" Oakley's smile turned playful. "Now I suggest we take advantage of the fact that we're still snowed in. The meeting's been postponed, and this very comfortable bed is already warm." She pretended to consider this. "That does sound like an efficient use of resources, Mr. Trevor." "I've always admired your strategic thinking, Ms. Brett." His hands were already drawing her closer. "Though I believe we agreed to drop the formalities." "Old habits," she murmured against his lips. "You'll have to help me break them." "With pleasure," he growled, and then there was no more need for words. The storm continued to recede, but neither of them noticed. They were too caught up in their own private symphony, in the discovery that some truths could only be spoken in touches and sighs, in the realization that the walls they'd maintained for so long had been protecting them from the very thing they needed most. Later, much later, they would have to face the world again. There would be meetings and announcements, reactions to manage, and changes to implement. The path ahead wouldn't be entirely smooth. Nothing worth having ever was. But they would face it together, strengthened by the knowledge that their love had been forged in the midst of a storm, tested by thunder and ice, and emerged stronger for it. For now, though, they had this moment, this room, this dawning day full of promise. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Chapter 8. Dawn's Betrayal. The sun had barely crested the mountains when Callista slipped from the warmth of room 307. Oakley's even breathing told her he was still deep in sleep, exhausted from their night of shared confessions and passion. She moved silently through the room, gathering her things with the efficiency that had made her an exceptional executive assistant. Her phone, finally receiving signal again as the storm cleared, buzzed with dozens of notifications. But it was one particular email that made her blood run cold. A message from James Chen, head of legal at Trevor Innovations, marked urgent and time-stamped from late last night. Standing in the bathroom with trembling hands, Callista read the confidential document attached to the email. The merger documents she'd helped prepare, the ones that were supposed to create this new, boundary-free company Oakley had described, told a very different story. The Stellar Group wasn't merging as equals. They were executing a hostile takeover with Oakley's apparent cooperation. The restructuring wasn't about breaking down hierarchies or creating something new. It was about consolidating power, eliminating opposition, and yes, removing certain problematic company policies, but only to allow for more direct control from the top. Her supposed promotion to Chief Strategy Officer, a temporary position designed to be eliminated within 6 months of the merger. Callista stared at her reflection in the antique mirror, watching as the woman who had finally allowed herself to love was replaced by the professional she'd spent years becoming. The bathroom's cold tile beneath her feet felt more real than the warmth of Oakley's embrace just hours ago. She dressed quickly, silently, her mind racing through the implications. How long had he been planning this? Had last night been just another strategic move, a way to ensure her cooperation during the crucial transition period? The thought made her physically ill. A note. She should leave a note. But what could she possibly say? "Thanks for the promotion that you knew would disappear in 6 months. Congratulations on orchestrating the perfect manipulation." In the end, she wrote just 3 words on the hotel stationery. "This was mistaken. The halls of Pinecrest Inn were silent as she made her way downstairs, the ancient floorboards somehow remaining quiet under her feet. Mrs. Whitman was nowhere to be seen. Small mercies. Callista didn't think she could bear the knowing twinkle in the elderly woman's eyes right now. Outside, the storm's aftermath created an alien landscape. Ice coated every surface, transforming trees into crystal sculptures and making the world gleam like a diamond in the early morning light. Her rental car, arranged through a series of texts while she dressed, waited in the parking lot, its engine already running against the cold. As she drove away from Pinecrest Inn, Callista forced herself not to look in the rearview mirror. She knew if she saw room 307's windows, saw any movement behind them, her resolve might crack. The professional mask she'd worn for years had never felt heavier, but it was also never more necessary. The drive back to Reno was a blur of ice-covered roads and racing thoughts. She pulled into her parking spot at Trevor Innovations just as the city was coming to life, the familiar skyscraper looming over her like an accusation. Her office would have everything she needed to verify the information in Chen's email, access to the full merger documentation, the real restructuring plans, the truth behind Oakley's pretty lies. The executive floor was empty when she arrived, her heels clicking against marble in a rhythm that felt like a funeral march. Her office, with its view of Oakley's door, had never felt more like a cage. She logged into the secure server with hands that refused to shake. She wouldn't allow them that weakness. Document after document confirmed her worst fears. The merger wasn't about creating something new, it was about Oakley Trevor becoming the most powerful CEO in Nevada's corporate history. The Stellar Group would provide the leverage he needed to eliminate the board's oversight, restructure the company to his exact specifications, and yes, change those problematic fraternization policies, but not for love, for control. "You're in early." Oakley's voice from her doorway made her jump. He looked devastating in a fresh suit, his hair still slightly damp from a shower. When had he gotten back to the city? How long had she been lost in her research? "Lots to catch up on," she replied, proud of how steady her voice remained. "The merger won't process itself." Something flickered in his eyes. Concern. Guilt. She couldn't read him anymore, couldn't trust her interpretation of his expressions. Everything she thought she knew about him had been called into question. "About last night," he began, taking a step into her office. "Was a mistake," she interrupted coldly. "One I'd prefer not to discuss in the workplace." He stilled, and for a moment she saw something like pain cross his features. "Callista." "Miss Brett," she corrected, turning back to her computer screen. "If there's nothing else, Mr. Trevor, I have quite a lot of work to do. The Stellar Group representatives will be arriving this afternoon." The silence that followed was deafening. She could feel his eyes on her, could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to understand what had changed between the warmth of room 307 and the cold light of morning. "This isn't like you," he finally said, his voice low and intense. "Running away without explanation. There's something else going on." "What's going on is that I had a momentary lapse in judgment." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. "One that won't be repeated. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for the merger meeting." "The meeting's been cancelled." His voice had taken on that dangerous edge she recognized from difficult negotiations. "The Stellar Group's representatives won't be coming today, or any day." Callista's head snapped up. "What?" "I terminated the merger negotiations this morning." He took another step into her office, closing the door behind him. "Care to tell me why you're really here, going through confidential merger documents at dawn?" Her heart raced. The game had changed, but she couldn't tell if she was winning or losing. "I received some concerning information about the true nature of the merger." From James Chen? At her startled look, he smiled grimly. Did you really think I wouldn't know about that email? The one detailing a hostile takeover plan that would give me unprecedented power and eliminate certain inconvenient positions. Including mine, she said softly. Including yours. He moved to stand directly in front of her desk, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. Tell me something, Callista. Did you read the timestamp on those documents? Did you notice who authored them? She frowned, pulling up the files again. The timestamps were from 6 months ago, and the author, the Stellar Group's CEO, she whispered, the pieces starting to fall into place. This was their plan. Their attempt to take control of my company, yes. Oakley's voice was gentle now. They thought if they could prove I was violating company policy, say, by having a relationship with a subordinate, they could force me out. The policy changes weren't about giving us freedom, they were about setting a trap. But you said the restructuring, my promotion, are exactly what I told you they were. Real changes, real opportunities, real feelings. He rounded her desk, turning her chair to face him. I terminated the merger because I found evidence they were planning to use last night against us. Someone at the inn worked for them. Probably tipped them off about our situation. Callista's mind reeled. Mrs. Whitman? Her grandson sits on their board. Oakley knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. I was trying to protect you. The merger documents you saw were their plan, not mine. I thought if I could handle it quietly, you'd never have to know how they tried to use us. Why didn't you tell me? The hurt in her voice was real now, but for a different reason. Because I wanted last night to be about us. Just us. Not corporate espionage or hostile takeovers or any of the ugly parts of this business. His thumbs traced patterns on her palms. I love you, Callista. Everything I said in that room was true. Everything I felt was real. Tears spilled down her cheeks, relief and residual fear and love, all mixing together. I thought, when I saw those documents, you thought I'd manipulated you, used you. The pain in his voice matched her own. I would never do that to you. Never. She leaned forward until their foreheads touched, breathing in his familiar scent. I'm sorry I doubted you. Sorry I ran. I'm sorry I didn't tell you everything. He reached up to wipe away her tears. No more secrets. No more hidden agendas. From now on, we face everything together. Deal? Deal, she whispered, and sealed it with a kiss that tasted of salt and promises. Outside her office window, the morning sun had turned the ice-covered city into a glittering wonderland. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, much like the truth had transformed their understanding of each other. They had weathered their first real test, faced their fears and doubts, and emerged stronger. The merged company would never happen now, but something better had taken its place. Trust, tested by fire and ice, proven in the crucible of almost betrayal. And as Oakley pulled her into his arms, right there in her office where anyone could see, Callista realized that some risks were worth taking, some rules worth breaking, for the kind of love that could survive both storms and secrets. Chapter 9. Corporate Shadows. Weeks passed in a blur of corporate restructuring and carefully navigated transitions. Callista had moved to a new office on the 39th floor, no longer within sight of Oakley's door, but with an even more impressive view of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The same mountains that had witnessed their transformation from CEO and executive assistant to something far more complex and beautiful. The afternoon sun streamed through her floor-to-ceiling windows as she reviewed the latest batch of internal documents. Her promotion to Chief Strategy Officer had been announced the day after the failed Stellar Group merger, along with a complete reorganization of Trevor Innovations' corporate structure. The board had been initially skeptical, but Callista's track record spoke for itself. A knock at her door made her look up. Margaret Chen, James Chen's wife and head of human resources, stood in the doorway with an expression that made Callista's heart sink. "Do you have a moment?" Margaret asked, her normally warm voice tight with concern. "There's something you need to see." Callista gestured to the chair across from her desk, noting how Margaret closed the door before sitting. "What's wrong?" "These came across my desk this morning." Margaret placed a thick folder between them. "Someone's been doing some digging into the night you and Oakley spent at Pinecrest Inn. The memory of that night, the storm, the confessions, the almost betrayal and ultimate truth flashed through Callista's mind." "The Stellar Group?" "No." Margaret opened the folder, revealing photographs. "Someone inside Trevor Innovations, someone who doesn't approve of your rapid advancement." The photos were grainy but clear enough. Callista and Oakley entering the inn, standing close at the front desk, his coat around her shoulders. Innocent moments made to look suspicious by the lens of corporate politics. "Who?" Callista asked, though she already had her suspicions. "Victor Davidson." Margaret named the board member who had most vocally opposed Callista's promotion. "He's building a case to challenge your appointment, claiming your relationship with Oakley influenced the decision." A month ago, this kind of threat would have terrified Callista. Now she felt only a calm determination. "Let me guess. He's demanding my resignation in exchange for keeping quiet. He's presenting his evidence to the board tomorrow morning." Margaret's eyes held both warning and sympathy. Unless I step down quietly." Callista stood, moving to the window. The mountains were shrouded in clouds today, reminding her of that fateful storm. "What does Oakley know about this?" "Nothing yet. I came to you first, hoping we could handle this internally." Callista turned back to her mentor and friend. "You know, the night of that storm, I learned something important about corporate politics. The truth isn't always what it appears to be at first glance." She moved back to her desk, pulling up files on her computer with swift efficiency. "Before we discuss Victor's demands, I think you should see these." Documents filled her screen. Emails, financial records, meeting minutes, all pointing to a pattern of behavior that would interest the SEC considerably. "Victor's been orchestrating his own little scheme," Callista explained, turning the monitor so Margaret could see. "Using board information to manipulate stock trades through shell companies. I discovered it while reviewing the Stellar Group merger documents." Margaret's eyes widened as she scanned the evidence. "How long have you known about this?" "Since my first week as CSO. I was waiting to bring it to the board until I had compiled everything." Callista's smile held a hint of steel. "I learned from Oakley that timing is everything in corporate warfare." "You've changed," Margaret observed, but her tone held approval. "The Callista I knew before would have been devastated by these photos, worried about appearances and propriety. The woman in those photos was afraid of breaking rules, afraid of appearing unprofessional." Callista touched her screen, bringing up one final document. "But that night taught me that sometimes the most professional thing you can do is fight for what's right, regardless of how it might look." The document was a complete proposal for a new corporate governance structure, one that would modernize Trevor Innovations' approach to workplace relationships while strengthening ethical oversight. "I've been working on this since my promotion," Callista explained. "It addresses everything: conflict of interest protocols, performance review standards, ethical guidelines. Victor's attack actually gives us the perfect opportunity to implement it." Margaret studied her with new respect. "You knew this was coming." "I knew someone would try something like this eventually. Office politics doesn't change overnight, even when policies do." Callista sat back in her chair, projecting the calm confidence she'd learned from Oakley. "The question is, what do we do with this information?" Before Margaret could respond, another knock interrupted them. Oakley stood in the doorway, his expression serious. I just heard about Victor's plans for tomorrow's board meeting. Callista met his eyes across the room, seeing the mixture of concern and pride there. Perfect timing. We were just discussing how to handle it. He entered, closing the door behind him. The energy in the room shifted with his presence, but not in the way it once would have. This wasn't CEO Oakley Trevor entering his executive assistant's office. This was her partner, joining a strategic discussion as an equal. I assume you've already figured out 3 different ways to handle this? His smile held intimate knowledge of her capabilities. 4, actually. She turned her monitor so he could see the documents. Though I think option 3 has the most potential for long-term positive change. Margaret looked between them, shaking her head in amazement. You two really are perfect for each other, aren't you? She makes me better, Oakley said simply, moving to stand behind Callista's chair, both professionally and personally. And he taught me that following your heart doesn't make you less professional, Callista added, reaching up to squeeze his hand. It just makes you more authentic. So, what's option 3? Margaret asked, pulling them back to the matter at hand. Callista outlined her plan, using Victor's attack as a catalyst for implementing comprehensive corporate governance reform. The new policies would protect workplace relationships that met ethical guidelines while creating stricter oversight for actual conflicts of interest like Victor's trading schemes. We present it to the board immediately after Victor makes his accusations, she explained. Show them that we're not just defending our relationship, we're creating a better, more ethical company culture. And the evidence of his insider trading, Margaret asked, goes to the SEC either way, Oakley stated firmly. That kind of behavior has no place in my company. Our company, Callista corrected gently, the reforms make that official too. More distributed leadership, better checks and balances. Like I said, Oakley smiled, she makes me better. They spent the next hour refining the strategy, Margaret's HR expertise, helping strengthen the new policies. By the time she left, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting Callista's office in shades of gold and rose. You're incredible, Oakley said once they were alone, pulling her up from her chair into his arms. You turned a potential scandal into an opportunity for positive change. I learned from the best. She leaned into his embrace, remembering how far they'd come from that stormy night. Though I still can't believe Victor thought some grainy photos would be enough to break us up. He doesn't understand what we have. Oakley's voice was soft against her hair. He sees a cliché. Boss and assistant having an affair. He can't comprehend a genuine partnership of equals. His loss. Callista pulled back to meet his eyes. Ready to shake up the corporate world again tomorrow? With you by my side? Always. He kissed her softly, then more deeply, until the last rays of sunlight had faded from the sky. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. A hostile board member, new policies to implement, a company culture to transform. But they would face it together. Stronger for every storm they'd weathered, every shadow they'd illuminated, every boundary they'd redefined. And as they left the office that evening, hand in hand without caring who saw, both knew that some love stories weren't about breaking rules. They were about writing new ones, better ones, ones that recognized that the heart's wisdom could coexist with professional excellence, that passion and competence weren't mutually exclusive, that the greatest innovations often came from daring to challenge the status quo. The mountains stood sentinel against the darkening sky, their peaks still holding the memory of that transformative storm. In their shadow, Callista and Oakley had found not just love, but a new way of leading, of living, of being, and no amount of corporate shadows could dim the light they'd kindled in room 307. Chapter 10. Winter's return. Exactly 1 year had passed since the storm that changed everything. The Sierra Nevada mountains wore their winter coat proudly, snow-capped peaks gleaming against a crystal-clear sky. Callista Brett stood at her office window, watching the sun set behind those familiar peaks, her mind drifting back to that fateful night at Pinecrest Inn. The past year had been transformative for both Trevor Innovations and its leadership. The corporate governance reforms she'd implemented had become a model for other companies, earning recognition from industry leaders and business publications. Victor Davidson's attempted power play had backfired spectacularly, leading to his resignation and a stronger, more ethical board of directors. But more than that, the year had proved that love and professional excellence could coexist beautifully. Callista's work as Chief Strategy Officer had driven the company to record profits, while her relationship with Oakley had deepened into something that made both of them better leaders and better people. A light knock on her door interrupted her reflection. Margaret Chen stood there, smiling mysteriously. "Your car is waiting downstairs," Callista frowned. "I didn't order a car." "No, but someone who loves you did." Margaret's eyes twinkled. "He said to tell you to trust him, just like you did a year ago today." Understanding dawned, sending a flutter through Callista's stomach. She gathered her coat and bag, trying to suppress her smile. "Any hints about where I'm going?" "Just that you might want these." Margaret handed her a small overnight bag. "I took the liberty of packing some essentials, including that blue silk nightgown you bought last month." "Margaret!" Callista felt her cheeks warm, even as she accepted the bag. "I can't believe you've become his co-conspirator. Someone has to help him surprise the most organized woman in Nevada." Margaret shooed her toward the elevator. "Go. Be romantic. The company won't fall apart without you for one night." The private elevator, another perk of her C-suite position, whisked her to the lobby. Outside, a familiar midnight blue Audi RS7 waited, its engine purring in the cold evening air. But instead of Oakley at the wheel, she found a professional driver who opened the door with a courteous nod. On the back seat lay a single red rose and a note in Oakley's distinctive handwriting: "Follow the memories." Oh. The car pulled away from Trevor Innovations headquarters, taking the same route they'd driven that stormy night a year ago. Callista's heart raced as she recognized the familiar turns, the way the city gave way to mountain roads, the gradual climb into the Sierra Nevada's embrace. Snow began to fall softly, fat flakes drifting past the windows like nature's confetti. But unlike last year's violent storm, this snowfall was gentle, romantic, as if the weather itself was celebrating their anniversary. Pinecrest Inn appeared through the curtain of snow like a scene from a fairy tale. Every window glowed with warm light, and delicate ice sculptures lined the path to the entrance. Mrs. Whitman stood in the doorway, her silver hair arranged in its usual elegant bun, her smile knowing. "Welcome back, dear," she said warmly as Callista approached. "Though I must apologize for my part in last year's drama, my grandson can be quite persuasive when he wants something." "Water under the bridge," Callista assured her, understanding now why Oakley had chosen to return here. Some places held power beyond mere memory. They were catalysts for transformation. "Is he room 307? Mrs. Whitman's eyes twinkled. "Some things are meant to come full circle." The stairs creaked familiarly under Callista's feet as she climbed to the third floor. The hallway looked exactly as she remembered, though this time strings of tiny white lights had been woven through the antique light fixtures, creating a magical atmosphere. Room 307's door stood slightly ajar, firelight spilling into the hallway. Callista's hand trembled slightly as she pushed it open, her breath catching at the sight before her. The room had been transformed. Hundreds of candles created a warm, golden glow, their light reflecting off crystal vases filled with winter roses. The antique bed was made up with what looked like the same blue and silver quilt from a year ago. And there, by the window where they'd shared their first kiss, stood Oakley. He turned at her entrance, and the love in his eyes made her heart skip. "You came. Did you doubt I would?" "Never." He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms. "Not since the day you told the board they were wrong about that merger strategy. I've never doubted you since then." Callista melted into his embrace, breathing in his familiar scent. "The room looks beautiful, though I notice the heating is working perfectly this time. I may have had them upgrade the system after last year." His chuckle rumbled through his chest. "Though I have to admit that failing radiator did work in my favor." I seem to remember something about body heat being the most efficient way to warm someone up." She smiled against his shoulder. "Very professional medical advice, as I recall." "Speaking of professional..." Oakley pulled back slightly, his expression growing serious. "There's something I need to tell you." Callista's heart skipped for a different reason. "What is it?" "I'm stepping down as CEO." The words hung in the air between them. Callista blinked, trying to process their meaning. "What? Why?" "Because the company needs new leadership for its next phase of growth." His hands came up to cup her face. "Leadership that understands both innovation and ethics, that can balance progress with humanity. Leadership like yours." Understanding dawned. "Me? But..." "The board voted this morning. Unanimously." His smile was full of pride and love. "You're the best person for the job, Callista. You've proven that over and over this past year. I'll stay on as chairman, focusing on long-term strategy, but the day-to-day leadership should be in your hands." Tears pricked at her eyes. "You planned all this? The anniversary? The room?" "I wanted to bring you back to where it all began, where we first chose to trust in something bigger than ourselves." He brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "But I have one more question to ask, one that has nothing to do with corporate titles or professional advancement." Callista's heart stopped as Oakley stepped back and lowered himself to one knee. From his pocket he produced a ring that caught the candlelight like captured starfire. "Callista Brett," he said softly, his voice full of emotion. "A year ago in this room you taught me that some rules are meant to be broken and some love stories are worth any risk. You've made me a better leader, a better man, and a better human being. Will you make me the happiest man in Nevada and agree to be my wife?" Time seemed to stand still, just as it had that first night. The snow fell softly outside, candles flickered, and 2 hearts beat in perfect synchronization. Callista looked down at this man who had transformed from her boss into her partner, who had proven that love could coexist with ambition, who had helped her become the woman she was always meant to be. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes." The ring slid onto her finger, as if it had always belonged there. Oakley stood and pulled her into a kiss that tasted of joy and promise and future mornings. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blessing their reunion with winter's gentle touch. Later, much later, as they lay tangled in the blue and silver quilt, Callista traced patterns on Oakley's chest. "Did you really plan all this? The CEO position, the proposal?" "I planned to make you CEO months ago," he admitted, capturing her hand and kissing her fingers. "You earned that completely on your own merit. The proposal... I've been carrying that ring for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. When I realized today was our anniversary, it felt right to bring us back here." "Back to where we stopped pretending," she murmured. "Back to where we started being real." He pulled her closer. "Though I have to say, I like this snowfall much better than last year's storm." "I don't know." Callista propped herself up to look at him, love and mischief dancing in her eyes. That storm brought us together, changed everything. We would have found our way to each other eventually, Oakley said with certainty. Some love stories are inevitable. Like a CEO falling for his executive assistant, she teased. Like two people who were meant to be partners finding each other despite every obstacle. He kissed her softly. Though I have to admit the storm did speed things up considerably. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating the world in fresh possibility. Room 307 held them in its warm embrace, witness once again to a love that had redefined corporate boundaries and personal limits. The mountains stood sentinel against the night sky, their peaks touching stars that seemed to shine especially bright for this moment, this couple, this perfect completion of a circle that had begun in ice and storm and ended in warmth and certainty. And somewhere in the inn below, Mrs. Whitman smiled knowingly, understanding that sometimes the best love stories started with a storm and ended with gentle snow, transforming everything in between. Chapter 11. The Real Merger. Spring had touched the Sierra Nevada mountains with gentle fingers, melting snow into crystal streams and coaxing wildflowers from the earth. But today, Pinecrest Inn wore a mantle of white once more, not from nature's hand, but from thousands of winter roses and delicate white lights that transformed the historic building into something magical. Callista stood before the antique mirror in room 307, her heart thundering in her chest. The wedding dress she'd chosen was a masterpiece of silk and lace, its color matching the pure white of fresh snow. Her dark skin glowed against the fabric, and her braids had been woven with tiny crystals that caught the light like captured stars. "You look absolutely perfect," Margaret Chen said, adjusting the dress's train. "Though I still can't believe you chose to have the wedding here." "Where else?" Callista smiled, touching the antique key to room 307 that hung on a delicate chain around her neck, Oakley's gift that morning. "This place changed everything." Mrs. Whitman appeared in the doorway, her eyes misty. "The guests are ready, and that handsome groom of yours is about to wear a hole in the floorboards downstairs." Callista laughed, imagining Oakley, always so composed in board meetings, pacing nervously before their wedding. "How does he look?" "Like a man who can't believe his luck," Mrs. Whitman replied with a knowing smile. "Though if you ask me, you're both equally blessed to have found each other." The old innkeeper had become something of a fairy godmother to them over the past months, helping plan the intimate wedding with enthusiasm that made up for her previous deception. Her grandson's involvement with the Stellar Group's attempted takeover had been forgiven, transformed into a story they now told with laughter rather than pain. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of James Chen, who had agreed to walk Callista down the aisle. His eyes widened at the sight of her. "Well, if any of the board members still had doubts about your ability to handle both personal and professional responsibilities, this vision in white would silence them. The board's opinion of my personal life stopped mattering the day I became CEO," Callista reminded him with a smile. The past 6 months had proven she could lead Trevor Innovations with the same excellence she'd shown as CSO, while planning a wedding that would be talked about in Nevada society for years to come. "Speaking of which," Margaret produced an envelope from her clutch, "the latest quarterly reports came in this morning. Best numbers in company history." "Not today," Callista said firmly, though her fingers itched to reach for the envelope. "Today isn't about market shares or profit margins." "There's our bride," Mrs. Whitman approved. "Now, shall we get you married before that nervous groom of yours wears out my antique carpets?" The small wedding party made their way downstairs, where the inn's grand staircase had been decorated with cascading winter roses and twinkling lights. Music drifted up from below, not the traditional wedding march, but a soft piano rendition of the song that had been playing in Oakley's car that stormy night a year ago. At the bottom of the stairs, Through the windows of the inn's conservatory where the ceremony would take place, Callista caught a glimpse of Oakley. He stood tall and handsome in his tuxedo, snow-capped mountains visible through the glass walls behind him. Even from this distance, she could see the emotion on his face as he spoke with his best man. "Ready?" James asked softly, offering his arm. Callista took a deep breath, remembering another moment of decision in this very building. Just as she had chosen to trust her heart that night, she now chose to step forward into a future bright with promise. The ceremony space was intimate but stunning. The conservatory's glass walls and ceiling had been draped with sheer white fabric and twinkling lights, creating the effect of being inside a snow globe. The guests, a carefully chosen group of family and close friends, turned as the music changed and the doors opened. But Callista saw only Oakley. His eyes locked with hers across the space between them, and in that moment, every doubt, every fear, every corporate battle and professional struggle faded away. This was what they had been moving toward since that first board meeting when she dared to challenge him. She floated down the aisle on James's arm, her heart singing with each step that brought her closer to the man who had transformed from her boss into her partner, her love, her future. Oakley's eyes shone with tears as she reached him, his hand trembling slightly as he took hers. "You take my breath away," he whispered as she joined him before the officiant. The ceremony itself was a blur of emotion and perfect moments. They had written their own vows, weaving their unique story into promises for the future. "I vow to be your partner in all things," Oakley's voice rang clear and strong, "to support your dreams as you've supported mine, to challenge you to be ever better as you've challenged me, and to love you with the same passion and dedication you bring to everything you do." Callista's voice shook with emotion as she made her own promises. "I vow to trust in us as I learned to trust that stormy night, to be your equal in love as in business, to break down any walls that try to separate us and to face every challenge and celebration by your side." The exchange of rings, the official pronouncement, the first kiss as husband and wife. Each moment felt both surreal and perfectly right. The guests applauded as they turned to face them, but Callista and Oakley remained in their own world for a moment longer, foreheads touching, hearts beating in sync. The reception was held in the inn's grand dining room, transformed into a winter wonderland that rivaled the storm that had first brought them together. Mrs. Whitman had outdone herself with the decorations, combining elegant corporate sophistication with romantic whimsy in a way that perfectly represented the couple. During the dinner, Margaret rose to give a toast that had everyone alternating between laughter and tears. To the couple who proved that the greatest mergers aren't about corporate takeovers, but about two hearts finding their perfect match. And to room 307, may it continue to work its magic for years to come. Later, as they shared their first dance, Oakley pulled Callista close enough to whisper in her ear, "Happy?" "Perfect," she replied, then smiled mischievously. "Though I do have one piece of business news that couldn't wait until after the honeymoon." "Oh?" His eyebrow raised in that familiar way that still made her heart skip. "We're going to need to implement those new parental leave policies sooner than expected." She watched understanding dawn in his eyes. "About 7 months sooner." Joy bloomed across Oakley's face as he processed her meaning. His arms tightened around her as he spun her in an impromptu twirl that made their guests cheer. "Really?" "Really," she confirmed, laughing at his excitement. "Though I plan to run the company right up until delivery, and before you protest, remember who's CEO now." "I wouldn't dare argue with my boss," he teased, pulling her close again. "I love you, Mrs. Trevor." "I love you too," she whispered back. "Though professionally I'm keeping Brett." "Of course you are." His smile was proud and loving. You've built that name into a symbol of excellence, just like you've built us into something extraordinary." They danced on as snow began to fall outside, nature's blessing on their celebration. The mountains stood sentinel as they had that first night, witnesses to a love story that had redefined corporate culture and personal boundaries. And in the corner, Mrs. Whitman dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, knowing that some guests would later swear they saw a ghostly figure nodding approval, the spirit of the inn blessing this perfect merger of hearts and futures. Chapter 12. Love's Legacy. As the wedding reception drew to a close, snowflakes continued their gentle dance outside Pinecrest Inn's windows. The last of the guests had departed, leaving behind echoes of laughter and celebration. Callista and Oakley stood in the conservatory, his arms wrapped around her from behind as they watched the snow transform the world into a pristine canvas. "Do you believe in fate?" Callista asked softly, her wedding dress catching the remaining twinkling lights like captured starlight. "That some things are meant to be, no matter what obstacles stand in their way." Oakley's arms tightened around her, his chin resting on her shoulder. "I believe in courage," he replied, "the courage to recognize what's real and fight for it, even when the world says you shouldn't." She turned in his embrace, the news of their coming child still a joyful secret between them. Like a CEO falling in love with his executive assistant. Like two people refusing to let rules and expectations define their happiness. His hand drifted to her stomach, though there was no visible sign yet of the miracle growing within. "We're living proof that the greatest achievements come from daring to challenge convention." Mrs. Whitman appeared in the doorway, carrying something in her hands. "Before you leave for your honeymoon, I have something for you both." She presented them with an elegant leather-bound book. "I've kept this inn's guest book for 40 years, recording the stories of those who found love within these walls. But your story, yours deserves its own volume." Opening the book, they found their own journey chronicled in Mrs. Whitman's elegant handwriting, from that first stormy night to this snowy evening of their wedding. The final page held a message that brought tears to Callista's eyes. "To those who find this story in years to come, let it be known that true love isn't about breaking rules, but about having the wisdom to recognize when the rules themselves need to change." Callista and Oakley didn't just find love in room 307, they redefined what was possible when courage meets destiny. Their legacy isn't just in the company they transformed or the policies they changed. It's in proving that professional excellence and profound love can coexist, strengthen each other, and create something greater than either could achieve alone. May their story inspire others to trust their hearts, even when convention says otherwise. May it remind us that the greatest innovations often come from daring to imagine a different way. And may it stand as testament that some loves are worth every risk, every struggle, every moment of doubt. In their union, we witness not just a marriage of hearts, but a blueprint for a future where passion and professionalism, love and leadership, personal joy and professional excellence dance together in perfect harmony. Let those who read these pages understand, the truest mergers aren't written in corporate documents, but in the hearts of those brave enough to believe in something bigger than themselves. Oakley traced the words with gentle fingers. "She's right, you know. What we've built goes beyond us now." "A legacy of love and leadership," Callista agreed, thinking of their child, of future generations who might find inspiration in their story, proving that the heart's wisdom can be the greatest business strategy of all. They thanked Mrs. Whitman, who embraced them both with tears in her eyes before shooing them toward the stairs. "Go on now. Room 307 awaits its most important guests one last time before your honeymoon." Hand in hand, they climbed the familiar stairs, each step carrying the weight of memory and promise. the hallway where they'd first crossed the line between professional and personal. The door that had witnessed their transformation from CEO and executive assistant to partners in every sense. Room 307 welcomed them with warm firelight and scattered rose petals, the same blue and silver quilt adorning the bed. But now there were no doubts, no hesitations, no boundaries left to cross. Just two people who had dared to imagine something greater than convention allowed, and in doing so had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others. "To us," Oakley said softly, pulling Callista into a kiss that held all the passion of their first night together, tempered now with the certainty of their shared future. "To love's legacy," she whispered against his lips, "and to all those who might find courage in our story to write their own." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blessing their union just as that long-ago storm had blessed their beginning. The mountains stood eternal, guardians of a tale that would be told for generations, not just of how a CEO fell in love with his executive assistant, but of how two souls dared to challenge the world's expectations and, in doing so, created something extraordinary. And in every snowflake that danced past the windows of room 307, in every flicker of firelight that painted shadows on the walls, in every beat of their synchronized hearts, one truth rang clear. Some love stories do more than break the rules. They rewrite them entirely, creating new possibilities for all who follow. This was their legacy. Not just to each other, not just to the child growing beneath Callista's heart, but to every person who ever stood at the crossroads of convention and courage, wondering which path to choose. Through their story, they offered a simple but powerful truth: choose love. Choose courage. Choose to believe that something extraordinary awaits those brave enough to reach for it. As the night deepened around Pinecrest Inn, as the mountains kept their ancient watch, as the snow wove its gentle blanket over the world, Callista and Oakley held each other close in room 307, knowing that their story was both an ending and a beginning, a testament to the power of love to transform not just two lives, but the very rules that govern our world. For in their love, they had created not just a marriage, not just a modernized company, but a legacy that would inspire generations to come. A legacy that whispered, some rules are meant to be broken, some loves are meant to be fought for, and the greatest achievements come from daring to believe in the power of two hearts beating as one. Their story had begun in ice and storm, transformed through courage and trust, and culminated in this perfect moment of snow-blessed promise. And in every word written in Mrs. Whitman's leather-bound book, in every policy changed at Trevor Innovations, in every life touched by their example, one truth would remain eternal. Love, when it's real, has the power to change not just two lives, but the entire world. The end. Subscribe if you loved.